Anatoly, someone I met, and when I detected his accent and I asked him where he was from, he said he was from the Soviet Union, and he had me intrigued from the start. And so with that, Anatoly, can you introduce yourself and just give a little bit of background? The company we're talking about today is Solana, but I'm looking for us to get educated about all alternatives in this space. And I can't think of someone better to be schooled by than Anatoly, because he schooled me.
Thank you, Greg. Yeah, so I'm Anatoly. I'm co-founder of the Solana protocol, and Solana is a blockchain, an open permissionless smart contract platform, much like Ethereum, but fundamentally different design. So the kind of goal we're trying to achieve is this goal of open, permissionless, but also scalable and cheap, big enough for the entire globe to handle all of the world's financial transactions.
Tell me about some of the transaction throughput levels you're getting and compare that to some of the alternatives from Bitcoin to Ether to Ripple.
Yeah.
Just to give people, and also mention Visa, just to put yourself on the map of where you guys are and where theoretically where you can go.
So kind of, the best foot forward we can place would be a test that we could run on a high-end network like Google Cloud or AWS. It doesn't matter if it's co-located or distributed, but with beefy machines, we've seen performance over 100,000 TPS. The number that we like to claim is 50,000 TPS, and by transactions per second, these are atomic cryptographically signed transactions where a transfer occurs from one party to another, so from one public key to another.
And just give a comparison, because I think that number puts you in a competitive range with a commercial network like Visa, which is done it old school, but also way beyond the other alternatives out there that are more traditional. So just put some numbers on that.
Yeah, so Bitcoin and Ethereum, Bitcoin's at 7 transactions per second, Ethereum's at 11. Networks like EOS, Ripple, and kind of Tendermint, based proof of stake networks range somewhere between 200 to 300 TPS at peak times. So we are one of the first solutions that really kind of we bought into this idea that you can scale this entirely with hardware. So my background and kind of most of the team are former Qualcomm folks. We were there from, I was there from like 2003 till 2015. What I remember starting with those flip phones, which were like 16 megabit, 200 megahertz, 2 megabytes of RAM devices. And in the span of 10 years, having a supercomputer in my hand, relatively, like, 64-bit, 8-core, 4 gigabyte systems, which were much as powerful as desktops or laptops. And this is what kind of like, this was the, what was my kind of experience dealing in that space was that when there's demand for something, there's 2 million people working on optimizing silicon, networking, GPU cards, whatever it is that you want. If there's enough demand for it, there's enough hardware out there to kind of scale this. So the bottlenecks that we're dealing with are cryptographic operations, like how many signature verifications can you do per second? And then how much of this information can you transmit as fast as you can around the world? And how much of this memory can you store? And all of these things are doubling every 2 years, right? Like at a kind of an unfathomably fast pace. So this is what we're betting on. And so far it seems that we've been right. And, we started with needing like 4 GPU cards to get to 1 million signatures per second. Right now you only need 1, and that gets you 7 million per second. And for normal operations, you don't even need GPUs anymore.
Dude, this sounds like a very Soviet approach. Let me take like those big rockets that we Americans use those Russian rockets still to lift the heavy stuff up into space, because like
this
Russians
is what
are good
SpaceX is, right? This is the SpaceX approach, right? You build one engine that lifts X amount of pounds, strap 9 engines to the same thing, it lifts 9 times as much stuff.
Excellent. So let me go back and so my journey, and I met you along the way in this journey. I'm an old guy, so I went back to ancient history when there was something called proof of work. Then I stumbled across something called consensus in a poker game, which led me to Ripple. I met Juan Bennett like at Y Combinator, and that was like, I read a white paper about proof of stake. And then I met you and read a white paper about proof of history. So between those four big concepts, could you give your view of kind of a walk through the history path that I've been, and what each of those meant, and why you're where you are today, how you got to the concept of proof of history, because that's what I glommed onto when I met you, was that white paper on proof of history. But go back in time and give us a walk through history.
So proof of work is this idea that really kind of took off with Bitcoin. There've been other kind of iterations of it, but the main idea there is that it's really hard to know identities on the internet. You know, there's an arbitrary number of people. You know, people can have as many Reddit accounts, as many Facebook accounts. You know, they can create a ton of Twitter bots and followers. It's really hard to know whether one vote on the internet is actually one person. So this problem of it's called the Sybil resistance problem. How do I actually attribute, you know, value to a voice on the internet? It's a very challenging and hard problem, and people have been dealing with this since the birth of the internet, because as soon as there was email, you start getting 1 million emails per day of stuff that you didn't want. and this is what's called spam. And even out of the email research, folks kind of started thinking, well, what if it made it cost a little bit to send one of these messages, to actually vote? And one of the ideas they came up with is proof of work, which is I can force you to solve a cryptographic puzzle that takes you some amount of energy to solve, but takes almost no amount of energy for me to verify. So if it takes you like 10 cents of electricity to solve this puzzle, it takes me, you know, 1/1,000,000th of a cent of electricity to verify it. And therefore, I can kind of remove the amount of junk that I'm getting. And some very smart folks that were working in like the cypherpunk movement and working around this idea of self-sovereign money and digital cash, they kind of put all these things together and came up with proof of work and Nakamoto consensus. And it's kind of it's a magical construction, right? It like works so beautifully that it's really hard to, it was to me not so much invented, but discovered, right? It's like one of those things that is very, very clever that seems obvious in retrospect. And the idea there is that we can create security by using this proof of work puzzle and by forcing the vote, or how much anybody in the internet agrees of to be a thing of a certain state. Like for, you know, whether the sky is blue or red, it doesn't matter. But we can all kind of agree that it took 10 kilojoules of electricity to create that voice, to create that vote. And once we have that Sybil resistance, we can all agree on a ledger, right? Like a set of accounts and who has what amounts. And as soon as we have that, we kind of have this idea of financially or economically secure money, because it costs some amount of dollars to go take that electricity and convert it into this puzzle. And this system, you know, I think it was a combination of the 2008 financial crisis and this kind of very clever, easy to work with system that really took off, and Bitcoin kind of came out of this. The really hard problem here is these networks that rely on proof of work, they're communication networks, and communication is like an old school problem. So back in the day, people discovered radio, and you know, they figured out that if two radio towers transmit at the same time over the same frequency, you get noise. So if you have Bitcoin, which relies on this proof of work puzzle to transmit information, if you have enough participants in the network that they all start transmitting information at the same time, you get forks, or effectively you get noise. So the network is in this noisy state where nobody knows what is the actual final state of the ledger. Like, I don't know if the transactions that Greg thinks are the right ones that we should actually encode, or the transactions that I that Anatoly says are the right ones. If both of us claim to be like, okay, here's my copy of the ledger, and here's my electricity, but if that voice occurs at the same time, we still have to figure out who's right. So to deal with this problem, and like how most random transmission protocols work with, is they force the users to wait and to transmit at a frequency that the likelihood of a collision is really low. So proof of work, this is the difficulty adjustment. So when more voices come into the network and more voices want to vote and select transactions and what actually means that somebody spend money, when that number gets so large, that network adjusts the difficulty or the amount of electricity it takes to create a vote, such that only one vote is created every 10 minutes. 10 minutes is a long time for computers. It's a long time for global networks. You know, it's an incredibly fast amount of time when you're dealing with a banking system. That I can wire you arbitrary sums of money, and it takes 10 minutes, right, for you to receive it. That's crazy, right? And a lot, if you ever bought a house or dealt with any kind of like financial transactions that are interesting, you kind of realize, okay, that takes a day to do with a lot of paperwork. Bitcoin takes 10 minutes to get that signal, right? And it's a bit more complicated than 10 minutes, but effectively, like you get a lot of security just from that one single voice, a single vote. Unfortunately, you know, the world is so big and connected that Bitcoin, while I think phenomenally is proven to work for large transfers between, you know, China and the US, I can send $1 billion and in an hour, you know that you got it. You know, $1 billion with a Bitcoin. It doesn't really work well for very like, you know, small like Venmo style, Visa style transactions, or things that like traditional finance does a really good job at, like the New York Stock Exchange. Just simply the amount of data that needs to be transmitted is so large that those 10-minute intervals are just not, are too slow. And Bitcoin can't really be competitive in that sense. And folks at Ethereum that had this vision of a universal computer that can really run arbitrary computation, you can run exchanges in it, you can build lending protocols. They've optimized proof of work, I think, to its maximum limit. And that time frame is shrunk from 10 minutes to 12 and a half seconds. And the result of that, I think, if people have seen, is that there's a massive amount of innovation that happened in Ethereum. I think like phenomenal amount of adoption, considering how difficult it is to understand any of this stuff, how cryptography, how hard it is for normal humans. I think like Ethereum is just awesome, like in every sense of the word. But because it is still based on proof of work, and because it's dealing with these fundamental limits of communication, when you have arbitrary people transmitting information, it's stuck with this 12 and a half second limit. And because of that, right now, due to the awesome adoption that Ethereum is seeing, a single message costs $12 to $30 to send.
Right.
And that basically rules out almost every kind of use case, right? Most of my Venmo transactions are under $30, right? So for normal humans, it quickly became kind of too expensive.
Give a quick, I mean, consensus came along under Ripple, and why that's an optimization, not an optimization at the level that you're doing, but just from a history point of view, you want to talk about consensus and then maybe on to proof of stake?
So consensus is kind of an old idea. There's been papers about this stuff since probably before the 70s, but definitely like the ones that I'm aware of are 70s and 80s. And there's been technologies built that dealt with consensus one way or another, and wireless cellular networks definitely implement forms of consensus with various degrees of fault tolerance and reliability. So in '99, there's this paper published called Practical Byzantine Fault Tolerance, which really describes in steps, this is what you need for networks for a network of users or participants to agree on a single bit on some state. And this is very similar to the same problem that, you know, agreeing on a ledger or agreeing on a set of accounts that Bitcoin implements. The problem, though, that PBFT, or practical Byzantine fault tolerance, didn't really address is this idea of a vote. How do we know who's actually voting? How do we know how to agree on this, on the number of participants? And I don't know if Vitalik was kind of the first person to put these two together, but he basically said, well, you have digital currencies like Ethereum, and there's public keys that control that. Why don't we call that as the set of possible votes? And then when somebody votes, actually put up their currency that's part of the system, part of the universal computer, and that's their voice. And we know because of cryptography, we know because of this computation is secure and reproducible, that nobody's double voting. And if we can detect that people are double voting, that I vote for Grant's ledger and then I also vote for my own at the same time, we can create proofs that they've done so and punish them. And this was kind of, to me, this was a like controversial idea at the time, I would say. And a lot of folks, I think, in the space, Ripple and a bunch of other more practically minded folks that were not, maybe not as hardcore Bitcoin maximalists, thought that, oh yeah, this works, right? This is PBFT with some weighted ability to weight the participants in the network, and those weights can adjust because this currency can exchange, and you have some limits about how fast I can create my vote and remove it. And why don't we just go implement it and build stuff, right? And Ripple actually ended up being more of a quorum-based system, which has a more different set of rules about to discover who are the set of participants and how each one decides the weight of all the participants. But at the end of the day, you still have X amount of voters, and some majority of them have to agree on what is the current state of the network. So in some ways, this reduces this problem of needing energy, right? Like I don't need to go find a bunch of electricity to create a vote. I'm simply kind of have some currency that are assigned to me, or I acquire it financially, and then I can create this voice. But that doesn't really address the communication problem. And while these networks are faster than proof of work, because they're not as concerned about forking, the way that they're implemented is they're typically sequential. Like Tendermint specifically is maybe the easiest one to understand. You have a set of participants around the world. There's a single block producer that says, here's the block, everybody agrees. And there's a certain timeout whether the network agrees on that block or doesn't. And then the next block producer goes. So going back to that radio example, this is not how cellular networks work. So right. I even though I didn't work on radio and wireless protocols at Qualcomm, I was just there long enough that this is just something that I observed through osmosis. And really the first intuitive thing that you can think of is two radio towers transmit at the same time or the same frequency. Why don't we give each tower a clock that's synchronized and they alternate by time?
This is beginning to foreshadow this concept of the clock. So like so keep going with your story, because
yeah,
because it is a story, and that's what captivated me. It's a story.
So this idea is called TDMA, time division multiple access. This was the foundation of 2G networks. If you remember those, like kind of in mid 90s, they allowed millions of people to talk to each other around the world. And in fact, like CDMA, LTE, 5G, they all still have this TDMA component. The first thing that you do is you alternate by time, and then you do very clever frequency allocation and time allocation and scale this between multiple radio antennas. And it's just more engineering, but at the end of the day, you can't have two things transmit at the same time or the same frequency. You get noise. That idea is still there. So I was actually in 2017, the reason I became more interested in crypto than I was before was that I was actually interested in machine learning and deep learning. And a friend of mine and I started buying deep learning hardware and putting them in like data centers to build this kind of like side project, because while we were not, serving machine learning jobs, we could mine crypto and pay for the capital costs of this hardware.
Who was paying for the electricity? You guys paid for your own electricity, or just kind of?
No, we paid.
A few moments later.
Hey guys.
Hey there.
Back. Okay.
All right.
Sorry.
You got cut off for there, but you were starting to talk. We're talking about really, I guess, multiplexing. So back to where you were when you were putting these machines into the data centers. These machine learning.
Yeah. I wasn't thinking about building a blockchain. I was simply thinking like how to use cryptocurrency, and I started really kind of getting deeper into what is proof of work and why does it work, why is it necessary. And one day I had like 2 coffees and a beer, and I was up till 4 a.m. because the mixture kind of like didn't sit well with me. And I had this eureka moment that using the same puzzle that's used to measure electricity or to do the Sybil resistance step in proof of work, you can tweak that puzzle and just measure passage of time. So that's not sufficient to create a vote or create a voice, right, to do the Sybil resistance check, but it's sufficient to create an understanding of time in a trustless way. That the problem with like why TDMA doesn't work for Bitcoin is because somebody has to go say, this is the clock and everybody should trust my understanding of time. And if you have this kind of third party that dictates time in the network, it can no longer be truly a decentralized system, because that third party can really decide the order of all the events, right? If this is an exchange, whoever controls the clock controls all the trades. Because I knew that I kind of had that part of the puzzle figured out, that really like, I honestly couldn't like sleep for a week. I was like, oh man, I've got it. Like I've solved this whole problem. Like you can actually take all the stuff that we worked on at Qualcomm for like decades to optimize these systems, and you can then apply all that technology, all that knowledge that is basically standard engineering, and scale cryptocurrencies to whatever limit that you want. Like if you need to handle 1 million transactions per second, you just need hardware and software, and that's it.